They did not consummate the marriage in private. That would have been mercy. What Byzantine emperors did to imperial brides on their wedding nights was designed not as intimacy, but as public ritual, a theatrical demonstration of power witnessed by dozens of officials, priests, and court functionaries who documented every moment. It was mandatory, codified in imperial law, and for the young women draped in purple silk, it transformed what should have been sacred into systematic humiliation. The bedchamber doors of the sacred palace stood open on the night Princess Theodora Dukaina became an empress. She was 16 years old, pale as the ivory inlays decorating the chamber walls, her hands trembling so violently that the pearl-encrusted wedding crown kept slipping forward across her brow. Incense smoke hung thick in the air, and frankincense meant to sanctify what was about to occur, but beneath it lingered something else. The acrid scent of fierce sweat. The metallic taste of blood where she had bitten her lip raw during the 7-hour wedding ceremony. Behind her, arranged in careful hierarchical order, stood the witnesses. The Patriarch of Constantinople in gold vestments, the Grand Chamberlain clutching wax tablets to record the proceedings, 3 palace eunuchs whose sole purpose was to verify imperial consummation, 12 ladies-in-waiting who would later testify before the Senate, and beyond them, in the shadowed corners, scribes whose pens scratched against parchment, documenting every detail for archives that would outlast empires. She had not been told this would happen. None of them ever were. The emperor, her husband, now, though she had met him only twice before this night, stood beside the canopy bed draped in Tyrian purple. He was 43 years old. She could see her reflection in his cold, calculating eyes, and in that reflection, she was not a bride. She was a political necessity, a womb to produce heirs, a body to be displayed, penetrated, and documented as proof of dynastic legitimacy. What followed was worse than any death a Byzantine princess could imagine, because after this night she would have to live with the memory. Every day, for however many years her survival would last in the empire's most dangerous palace. The sacred palace of Constantinople had been designed, over centuries of imperial refinement, to transform intimate acts into public theatre. The imperial bedchamber where consummation occurred was not a private sanctuary, but a carefully constructed stage. The bed itself sat elevated on a marble platform, 3 steps above floor level, ensuring unobstructed viewing for all required witnesses. Purple silk curtains hung from golden columns, but they remained tied open during wedding nights, mere decorative frames for the performance that was mandatory. Mosaics covered every surface. Christ Pantocrator gazed down from the dome ceiling, his enormous eyes watching. Saints lined the walls in rigid rows, their gilded halos catching lamplight, their painted faces frozen in expressions of holy judgment. The floor beneath the bed featured an intricate patterned purple porphyry from Egypt, green serpentine from Sparta, white marble from Proconnesian quarries, arranged in concentric circles that naturally drew every eye toward the elevated platform at the chamber's center. 16 oil lamps burned in wall niches, their flames steady and bright, eliminating any shadow that might offer psychological shelter. The light was calculated, designed. There would be no darkness to hide in. Palace records from the reign of Basil II described the chamber's acoustics as perfectly resonant, meaning every sound carried, every breath, every whispered prayer or stifled sob, every rustle of silk or creak of the bed frame. The architect who designed these renovations in 996 CE received a substantial bonus. His creation ensured that witnesses in the back of the chamber could hear verification of consummation without needing to step closer to the bed itself. But the chamber was only the setting. The ritual itself was far more calculated. The protocol for imperial wedding nights was codified in the Book of Ceremonies, compiled under Constantine VII, Porphyrogenitos, a text so detailed it specified exactly how many steps the bride should take from the chapel to the bedchamber. the precise angle at which she should bow before the patriarch, even the order in which her garments would be removed and by whom. Nothing was left to chance. Nothing was private. The ritual began with the blessing of the bed. The patriarch circled the elevated platform 3 times, swinging a censer that left trails of smoke hanging in the lamplight, chanting verses from the Song of Solomon that reframed sexual submission as holy duty. "Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth," the prayer began, but in the context of forced witness and political necessity, the words twisted into something grotesque. Then came the disrobing, not by the groom, that would come later, but by the head lady in waiting, who removed each layer of the bride's ceremonial garments while reciting the symbolic meaning of every piece. The golden belt represented virginity, removed and placed on a velvet cushion held by a eunuch. The pearl-studded veil symbolized maidenhood's end, folded carefully and handed to another official for archival preservation. The outer robe of purple silk, so heavy with gold thread that it took 2 women to lift, was draped across a stand where it would remain on display for 3 days as proof the wedding had occurred. Beneath it all, the bride wore only a thin white linen shift, translucent in the lamplight, designed not for modesty, but for easy removal, for symbolic transformation from virgin princess to imperial wife. From person to vessel, Princess Anna Damascene, who endured this ritual in 1067, later wrote in a fragmentary journal discovered in a monastery library, "They stripped me as one would strip a corpse for burial. Methodically, without shame. I ceased to be human in that moment. I became empire property, no different than the purple silk they folded so carefully while my body stood exposed before strangers whose names I did not even know." The witnesses watched, the scribes recorded, and through it all, the bride was expected to remain silent, composed, grateful for the honor of becoming empress. What happened next was even more calculated. The consummation itself was not merely observed, it was verified through systematic documentation designed to eliminate any future dynastic dispute. Once the bride had been positioned on the bed by the attending ladies-in-waiting arranged on her back, arms at her sides, white shift pulled to her waist, the emperor would approach. The patriarch would recite a final blessing, his words echoing off mosaic-covered walls. "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth with heirs of the purple." Then the witnesses would fall silent, watching. The Grand Chamberlain held his wax tablet ready, stylus poised to mark the moment of penetration. The palace eunuchs stood at the foot of the bed, their role explicitly defined in court protocol, to observe the act closely enough to testify, if ever challenged, that consummation had definitively occurred, that the imperial line was legitimate, that the marriage was legally binding under both civil and ecclesiastical law. The emperor, trained from childhood in the performance of power, would proceed with mechanical efficiency. This was not intimacy, it was duty. Theatre, a political act dressed in the trappings of sacred ritual, performed for an audience whose presence was meant to sanctify what was fundamentally violation. Byzantine court documents from the 11th century described brides who fainted during consummation, their unconscious bodies simply repositioned by attending eunuchs so the ritual could continue to its required conclusion. Others who wept were reprimanded afterward for displaying emotion inappropriate to imperial dignity. One princess, whose name was deliberately erased from official records after she screamed during the act, was confined to a convent the following morning. Her marriage annulled, her family disgraced, her existence wiped from dynastic memory as punishment for her failure to perform submission gracefully. The event typically lasted between 15 and 30 minutes, according to testimony preserved in ecclesiastical court records, not because the act itself required such duration, but because the verification process demanded thoroughness. The patriarch needed to observe enough to certify before God. The eunuchs needed to witness enough to testify before the Senate. The ladies-in-waiting needed to inspect the bedsheets immediately afterward, for the blood that would be displayed publicly the following morning as proof of virginity lost, and imperial legitimacy secured. When it finally ended, the emperor would rise, dress, and depart. The bride would remain on the bed, exposed and bleeding, while officials conducted their inspections, measured the bloodstains, recorded their dimensions in official ledgers, collected samples of the sheets for preservation in palace archives, where fragments still survive today, thousand-year-old linen stained with rust-colored marks that once testified to the systematic destruction of teenage girls' dignity in the name of empire. But the ritual did not end even then. Dawn brought no privacy, no recovery, no merciful solitude. By imperial protocol, the bloodied bedsheets from the wedding night were displayed publicly from the palace balcony facing Yogazdian, the vast ceremonial plaza where thousands of Constantinople citizens could gather to witness proof of consummation. The sheets hung like battle banners, the rust-colored stains clearly visible against white linen, while heralds proclaimed the successful completion of imperial marriage. The crowd would cheer. Church bells would ring across the city, and inside the palace the new empress, bruised, bleeding, traumatized from the previous night's public violation, would be dressed in fresh purple silk and paraded through the palace complex to receive the congratulations of court officials who had watched her degradation hours earlier. She was expected to smile, to bow gracefully, to accept blessings and well wishes as though the previous night had been a joyful intimacy rather than systematic humiliation witnessed by dozens. Any display of distress was interpreted as rejection of imperial honor, a political liability that could endanger not just the bride herself, but her entire family's position at court. Archaeological excavations of palace servant quarters in 1964 uncovered fragments of letters exchanged between ladies-in-waiting during the reign of Constantine IX. One letter, partially preserved, describes a wedding night in chilling detail. The girl child, for she was only 14, blebbed so profusely that 3 sets of sheets were required. Still, they displayed the first, most heavily stained, while she lay fevered in the women's quarters, too damaged to walk. By afternoon she was dressed and presented at court, her face painted white to hide the pallor, her steps supported by attendants on either side. She smiled as commanded. She thanked the courtiers for their blessings, and that night alone, finally in her private chambers, she tore every pearl from her wedding crown and threw them one by one into the palace cisterns where they remained still, offerings to whatever gods might pity what Christian ritual had destroyed. But the public display served its purpose. Across the empire, from Antioch to Thessalonica, word would spread that the imperial marriage was legitimate, consummated, verified by unimpeachable witnesses. Future heirs would be unquestionably legitimate. The dynasty was secure. The price of that security was measured in the shattered psyches of 16-year-old girls who learned in one brutal night that their bodies belonged not to themselves, but to the state. And the cruelty did not end there. The wedding night ceremony was not a singular ordeal endured once and then mercifully concluded. Byzantine imperial protocol required verification of ongoing sexual relations, regular confirmation that the empress was fulfilling her primary duty of producing heirs, and while subsequent encounters were not witnessed as extensively as the wedding night, they remained subject to documentation and periodic observation that prevented any true privacy from ever existing within the imperial marriage. Palace eunuchs maintained detailed fertility records. They tracked the empress's monthly cycles with precision that would seem medical if it were not so invasive. When bleeding occurred, it was noted in official ledgers. When it ceased, indicating possible pregnancy, physicians were summoned to conduct examinations, physical inspections of the empress's body, performed with multiple witnesses present to confirm conception. If months passed without pregnancy, the scrutiny intensified. The empress would be questioned about the frequency of marital relations. Ladies-in-waiting would report on whether the emperor visited her chambers regularly. Palace physicians would examine her for physical defects that might prevent conception. And if pregnancy still did not occur, Suspicion would fall first on the empress, her perceived failure becoming grounds for potential divorce, exile, or forced confinement to a convent, while the emperor sought a new, more fertile bride. Empress Zoe Porphyrogenita endured 3 imperial marriages over 64 years. Court historian Michael Sellos recorded that each wedding night followed identical protocol: public witnesses, documented consummation, mourning sheet display regardless of Zoe's age. During her 3rd marriage, at 64 to Constantine IX, the ritual proceeded despite its obvious medical impossibility. Protocol demanded it. The empire required theatrical proof of legitimacy. Even when that proof had become grotesque parody, fragments of Zoe's own writings revealed the toll. After the 3rd time, I felt nothing. Not shame, long exhausted. Not anger, unsustainable over decades. Only a hollow numbness, as if my body had become a mechanical vessel for ritual continuing after all human feeling had been extinguished. Consent did not exist. An empress could not refuse her husband without risking annulment and exile. Imperial law granted the emperor the right to summon witnesses to marital relations whenever dynastic security required verification. She owned nothing, not even her body, which existed as property of the state. Medical texts from monastery archives describe treatments for injuries sustained during forced imperial relations, torn tissue, internal bleeding, infections that killed multiple empresses before 30. These injuries were never acknowledged publicly. They were recorded in euphemism, treated quietly by palace physicians sworn to silence, while the fiction of harmonious imperial marriage remained intact. The system was designed to be inescapable. Before examining how some women resisted, a pause. If these stories matter, if erased lives deserve remembrance as full human beings, support matters. Silence rewards cruelty. Now, back to the empresses who endured what could not be refused. The witnessed wedding night was not about verification alone. It established dominance. Submission was performed publicly, transforming intimacy into spectacle. The lesson required no explanation. You are not a person. You are a function of empire. Byzantine court theorists were explicit. Deministrando Imperio argues that witnessed consummation prevents succession disputes while reinforcing the empress's subordinate position. Trauma served political purpose. An empress broken early was unlikely to challenge authority. The ritual was designed to shatter before power could be claimed. Some dissociated, separating consciousness from body. Palace letters describe empresses who smiled for courtiers while tears fell silently. Others retreated into rigid devotion, praying for deliverance that never came. A few resisted. Empress Theodora, wife of Justinian, had endured the ritual herself. Procopius records that she later used her influence to modify protocol. She could not abolish witnessed consummation. It was too embedded in law. But she ensured physicians attended immediately afterward, and that private rooms were available for recovery before the morning display. Small mercies, but mercies nonetheless. Other empresses resisted differently. Some consumed herbs to prevent pregnancy, accepting the risk of exile rather than binding themselves permanently through children. Palace medical records note unusually high rates of unexplained infertility, suggesting deliberate contraception despite prohibition. In 2003, excavations in the women's quarters uncovered hidden caches of botanical materials, pennyroyal, silphium-known abortifacients, and contraceptives. They were concealed behind loose tiles and inside hollowed book covers. The finds suggest a quiet network of resistance, involving empresses, attendants, and physicians who risked everything to grant limited bodily autonomy. Some endured in silence. Silence was not consent. It was patience. And when their sons became emperors, some used maternal influence to quietly protect the next generation of imperial women. Constantinople fell in 1453. The sacred palace burned. The imperial bedchamber where generations endured, witnessed violation, collapsed into rubble. The trauma did not vanish. Witnessed consummation was not unique to Byzantium. Variants existed across medieval Europe, imperial China, Islamic courts. Rituals differed. Logic remained. Women's bodies as political instruments. Violation as theatre. Humanity subordinate to dynastic need. Modern excavations continue to recover fragments, letters hidden in walls, medical records buried in archives, graffiti scratched into stone. In 2019, restoration work in Hagia Sophia uncovered a carved Greek inscription hidden above the women's gallery. We were here. We endured. God sees what men choose to forget. No name, no date, just testimony. These women left no monuments. Official records reduced them to marriage contracts and birth registries, but fragments persist. Daughters turned instruments. Brides turned spectacle. Violations framed as honor. If this stayed with you, say which moment did. If you want more voices rescued from ritualized silence, you know what to do. These women deserve better than violation dressed as ceremony. The least we can offer now is remembrance. They were here, they endured, and now, finally, they are seen.